When I walked into the ballroom for my mother's legacy dinner, my sister was standing under her portrait wearing my mother's heirloom diamonds. For a second, the room admired her before anyone looked at me. That was the cruelest part. Not the necklace itself. Not even the fact that she had chosen this night. This room. This crowd of donors, board members, and old family friends. It was the way people first accepted the image. My mother's face glowed from the projection screen behind Vanessa, and the diamonds flashed at her throat as if the whole scene had been arranged to suggest continuity, as if loss had already been resolved, as if the daughter who stayed, organized, signed, handled, and held everything together had quietly become unnecessary. My father was beside her, one hand lightly at her back, wearing the solemn expression he saved for funerals and public speaking. My Aunt Rochelle touched the necklace and said, loudly enough for the women near her to hear, Helen would have wanted one of her daughters to carry this forward. One of her daughters. That line landed exactly the way it was meant to. My mother had not been dead long enough for this to feel natural, and everyone in that room knew who had managed her appointments, her records, her medications, her foundation calendar, and the shelter paperwork when her health began to fail. They knew who sat with her in treatment waiting rooms. They knew who stayed. Vanessa had the beauty of resemblance. I had done the work. And still, she was the one standing in the light wearing the proof of my mother's legacy. My husband Daniel came up beside me and followed my gaze. Lena, he said quietly, is that your mother's necklace? Yes. He turned to look at me, probably expecting anger, or tears, or at least movement. I gave him none. Across the room, Vanessa finally saw me. She did not flinch. She only lifted her chin a little, touching the center stone with 2 fingers, as if she had every right. Then my father made the room official. He tapped his glass, called for attention before the program even began, and smiled at the crowd. Before we start tonight, he said, I want to thank Vanessa for stepping into this evening with such grace. Legacy means something only when it continues, and some roles pass naturally to the daughter ready to carry them. A few people clapped. Not everyone. That hesitation mattered. Vanessa gave a soft, humble smile, like she had practiced receiving this exact sentence. My aunt dabbed at her eye. A donor near the front turned slightly in my direction. He knew. So did at least 6 other people in that room. They just chose the easier version of the moment and stayed still. I walked closer. Where did you get it? I asked. The question cut through the room more sharply than shouting would have. Vanessa kept smiling, but I saw the tiny pause before she answered. Dad had it brought from the safe this afternoon. We agreed it was time it stopped being hidden away. My father stepped in before I could say another word. Not tonight, Lena. That was the public humiliation. Clean. Controlled. Deliberate. My sister stood there wearing my mother's diamonds while my father framed me as the woman about to ruin a memorial evening if I objected. In one move, he gave Vanessa the place, gave the crowd a script, and handed me the role of problem. So I smiled. Not warmly. Not bitterly. Just enough to unsettle him. Of course, I said. That answer landed harder than a scene would have. My father's face changed for half a second. Vanessa's fingers stayed on the necklace, but not as steadily as before. I took my seat when dinner was called. And that was when I noticed the second insult. My place card had been moved. Vanessa had been seated near my father and the foundation chair where the photographs would be taken. My card had been shifted 2 seats down the table, beside a donor's husband who never remembered anyone's name unless money was attached to it. The message was obvious. The necklace was not the whole act. They were repositioning me in real time. During the first remarks, my father thanked the family for preserving my mother's vision. He named himself. He named Vanessa. He did not name me. This time, the silence in the room was easier to hear. Daniel leaned closer. He did that on purpose. Yes, I said, and suddenly the whole thing became clear. The necklace, the speech, the seating change, the timing before the official program. Vanessa standing under my mother's portrait. None of it had the feel of family impulse. It had structure. They were not just embarrassing me. They were introducing her in my place before something bigger happened. At the far end of the table, my 12-year-old son Noah had gone very still. He looked at Vanessa, then at me, and lowered his eyes to his plate. That small movement hurt more than my father's speech. Children know when they are watching an injustice adults are dressing up as tradition. After dinner, my father called for a family photo beneath the campaign display. Vanessa stepped directly under my mother's portrait with the necklace bright against her skin. My aunt moved in beside her. Then my father looked at me and said, smiling for the photographer, "Lena, come stand with your sister." He wanted the picture, the visual confirmation, the proof that I had accepted the transfer he had staged in public. So I walked over and stood beside her. The photographer raised the camera. Vanessa angled the diamonds toward the light, and without turning my head, I said softly enough that only she could hear, "Did they tell you Safe Access still records the name?" Her smile held. "Barely." The camera flashed. That was the first crack. Not in the room. Not yet. Just in her. And in that moment, I knew two things with perfect certainty. The first was that this had been planned. The second was that they had not planned it well enough. I did not confront anyone after the photo. That was the first thing my father expected and did not get. Vanessa stayed near my mother's portrait, still collecting smiles from donors and board members. But the room had shifted by a degree. Not enough for anyone to call it a scene. Just enough that a few people now looked at her necklace differently, as if admiration had been replaced by calculation. They had seen the pause in her face after I spoke. Small cracks matter. In rooms built on image, people remember the moment polish slips. Daniel took Noah to the car, and I stayed behind just long enough to stop looking dramatic. I thanked the event coordinator, picked up my coat, and let myself become part of the normal flow of the evening. If I left too fast, I would look wounded. If I stayed too close to my sister, I would look reactive. My family has always relied on other people choosing the simplest version of a story. I had no intention of helping them tonight. Near the brochure table, Elise stepped beside me with a stack of campaign cards in her hands. She kept her eyes on the display while she spoke. "Your father added a private board breakfast tomorrow morning." I turned to her. "That wasn't on the calendar." "No." She straightened the corner of a donor packet. "Small group. Board chair. Legal counsel. 2 key donors. Your father, Vanessa." That last name explained the dinner more clearly than the necklace ever could. "What's the meeting called?" I asked. Elise hesitated, then said, "Legacy Continuity and Leadership Transition." There it was. The real purpose. The dinner had not been about remembrance. It had been staging. My father wanted Vanessa seen in the necklace before he presented her in a formal room the next morning. The public image came first, then the procedure. He was trying to make the board feel that a transfer had already happened before anyone examined whether it legally had. "Was I excluded?" I asked. "Yes." She said it quietly, but without apology. That was one of the reasons I trusted her. She never softened facts into kindness when clarity mattered more. I nodded once. "Thank you." She finally looked at me. "Check the trust file tonight." Then she walked away with 2 empty champagne glasses in her hand, as if she had only stopped to tidy the table. I drove home alone. I needed the silence more than I needed comfort. When I got back, the house was quiet except for the kitchen light Daniel had left on for me. That ordinary light did something the ballroom could not. It made the betrayal feel real. Family cruelty always looks theatrical in public. At home, it becomes practical. It reaches the counter, the staircase, your child's hallway. Daniel was waiting by the island. "Noah asked if your mother gave Vanessa the necklace." "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't my answer to give." I set down my bag and nodded. "Good." Then I told him about the breakfast meeting. The wording. The guest list. The fact that my name had been deliberately left out. His face changed as he followed the structure of it. "They used the dinner to introduce her before the actual move," he said. "Yes. And the necklace made it look legitimate." "That was the point." He folded his arms. "Can they do it?" "Not cleanly. That answer came from instinct first, but I wanted paper behind it. So I went to the study, unlocked the lower cabinet, and pulled out the binders from my mother's probate review, the family trust, and the foundation governance files. My mother had made me copy everything during the last stretch of her illness, when she no longer trusted her memory to hold every detail. At the time, she called it good practice. Looking back, it felt more like a warning she did not want to say aloud. I started with the trust file, then the amended schedules, then the storage oversight agreement. The necklace was there, not as sentimental property, not as mother's diamonds. It was listed the way serious assets are listed, by item description, trust schedule, secured storage terms, and authorization conditions. The piece could be physically retrieved under limited family authority, but ceremonial use and formal release still had to match the verification protocol attached to the updated trust structure. I turned the page. Primary verification name, Lena Mercer. Mine. That was the first solid thing I had touched all night. My father may have had enough authority to get the box brought up from storage, but clean use of the necklace in a formal legacy setting still ran through a structure that carried my name, which meant Vanessa had not simply worn family jewelry to dinner. She had worn a monitored trust asset in a public setting while they tried to reposition the family narrative around it. Daniel came to the doorway. "You found something?" "Yes." He stepped inside. "How good?" I looked back at the page. Good enough to prove tonight was not just cruel. It was sloppy. That was better than anger. Sloppiness leaves records. A soft sound came from the hallway, and Noah appeared at the study door in socks, unable to sleep. His eyes dropped to the open binder, then lifted to my face. "Was Aunt Vanessa not supposed to wear it?" he asked. "No," I said. He absorbed that without dramatics. Then he asked the harder question. "Did Grandpa know?" Enough. That answer satisfied him because children do not need the whole legal theory to understand intent. They only need to know whether the adults involved were confused or deliberate. He looked at the papers again. "You're not going to fight with them." It was not a question. "No." "Why not?" "Because public cruelty feeds on reaction. Because my father wanted conflict, not record. Because structure is harder to argue with than emotion. Because the cleanest answer to theft is often procedure." But I only said, "Because I don't need to." He nodded slowly. "Grandma liked that you knew where everything was." That landed deeper than anything anyone had said in the ballroom. "She did," I said. He went back upstairs, and I stayed at the desk with the files open in front of me. For a moment, the house was completely still. No speeches. No champagne glasses. No portrait lighting. Just paper, signatures, and the ordinary sound of the refrigerator in the next room. That quiet did more to clarify the night than any emotion could have. So I opened the foundation binder next. The succession language was exactly what I expected my father had hoped no one would read carefully. Public-facing legacy roles could be presented with ceremony, but oversight of restricted assets, donor-linked obligations, and shelter governance required either a formal board vote or the temporary continuity authority already named in the internal documents. I found the memo. Temporary operational custodian during unsettled transition. Lena Mercer. Again me. That was when the entire shape of the dinner locked into place. They had built an image, not a transfer. Vanessa had the necklace, the portrait, the speech, the seating, the optics. I had the structure. And if they were trying to move quickly, it was because they knew image works best before documents enter the room. I checked the time. Nearly midnight. Then I opened the event email thread and found one more detail. The final speaking draft had been revised after my review. The file trail pointed to a private account Vanessa sometimes used when she wanted involvement to look professional. It was not enough to prove everything, but it was enough to prove this. She had not passively walked into an arrangement my father built for her. She had helped script it. That changed the line for me. A sister wearing a dead mother's necklace because a father allowed it was ugly. A sister helping draft the language that publicly removed the daughter who had actually done the work was something else. I photographed the trust pages, the governance memo, and the document trail with the timestamps visible. Then I sent one short email to myself, Daniel, and my mother's attorney's legacy records address. Subject: verification discrepancy regarding Schedule C ceremonial asset use and continuity language. No accusation. No speech. Just a clean timestamp, a document trail, and a formal concern placed where it could not later be denied. Daniel watched me hit send. So tomorrow? I closed the binder. Tomorrow, I said. They find out the dinner didn't make anything official. At 7:12 the next morning, my father texted me as if nothing had happened. Hope you rested. Big day for the foundation. We'll talk soon. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just tone management. The kind people use when they believe last night's humiliation has already been absorbed into the family and all that remains is for everyone else to act normal. I did not answer. Instead, I drove to my mother's attorney's office with a printed copy of the trust pages, the file trail from the event remarks, and the photo from the ballroom still sitting in my phone like a piece of staged evidence. Daniel had taken Noah to school without saying much. At breakfast, Noah had pushed cereal around his bowl and asked only one question. Are you going to Grandma's meeting? It isn't Grandma's meeting, I said. He looked at me for a second, then nodded. He understood more from that correction than most adults would have. By 8 o'clock, I was sitting across from Marjorie Bell, the attorney who had handled my mother's probate structure, trust amendments, and every unpleasant document my father had tried to simplify during the last 2 years of my mother's illness. Marjorie was in her 60s, exacting, and incapable of false comfort. My mother had liked her for the same reason I did. She reviewed the trust page first, then the oversight schedule, then the governance memo. Finally, she read the revised speaking draft metadata without changing expression. When was the necklace physically retrieved? She asked. Vanessa said yesterday afternoon. And the dinner was a formal foundation event with donors, board members, and press-adjacent guests. Yes, Marjorie leaned back slightly. Then this was not family sentiment. It was representational use. That was the phrase I had been waiting for. Representational use. Not a daughter borrowing jewelry for private grief. Not a widower opening a safe box because the evening felt emotional. They had used a trust-monitored heirloom in a formal setting to suggest legacy continuity, which meant the law would not read the scene the way my father wanted the room to read it. Can they argue ignorance? I asked. Your father might try. She tapped the page lightly. Your sister should not. Not if she participated in revised transition language and appeared at a pre-positioned public event under the decedent's portrait wearing a scheduled asset. There it was again. Not sentiment. Not misunderstanding. Positioning. Marjorie opened a side drawer and took out something I had not seen in years. The certified copy of my mother's final ceremonial asset memo, signed 6 months before her death. She slid it across the desk. I read the second paragraph once, and then a second time more slowly. In any public, charitable, commemorative, or institutional setting connected to the Mercer Family Foundation, designated heirloom items listed under Schedule C may not be worn, displayed, or symbolically assigned without written authorization attached to the active verification record. Written authorization. Attached to the active verification record. There had been no request, no email, no form, no signature, no call, nothing. The room went very still, because up until then, I had known they had crossed a line. Now I had proof they crossed it on paper first. Marjorie folded her hands. This is deliberate. I looked up. You're sure? Yes. She did not soften it. Someone reviewed the legacy positioning closely enough to stage the appearance, but not carefully enough to satisfy the conditions. That combination is never accidental. It means they wanted the effect of authority without the actual restraint of it. That was my father exactly. He liked systems best when they produced the appearance of dignity around his decisions. My mother built them to limit people like him. After she got sick, that difference stopped being theoretical. Marjorie turned to her computer and pulled up one more file from the archived probate correspondence. Your mother anticipated symbolic displacement. The phrase struck me harder than it should have. Symbolic displacement. As if she had known the fight might not begin with bank accounts or deeds, but with image. With who stood where. With who wore what. With who got photographed as continuity while the actual custodian was eased off stage. Marjorie opened the attachment. It was an email from my mother to her, dictated after a treatment round when the medication made her too tired to write more than a few lines herself. The body of it was brief and brutally clear. If family presentation begins shifting before the structures are settled, I want the record to protect the work, not the performance. I stared at the screen. Not because it surprised me. Because it did not. My mother had seen enough by then. The selective helpfulness. Vanessa appearing only when there were visitors. My father growing more interested in legacy optics. Once illness made him publicly sympathetic. They had mistaken my mother's exhaustion for blindness. She had simply moved her intelligence onto paper where they could not charm it. Marjorie printed the email and clipped it to the authorization memo. This will matter. Yes, I said. It also means the breakfast meeting is riskier for them than they know. That was when she made one more call, not to my father, not to the board, but to the private vault manager who handled the trust-monitored property releases attached to the Mercer schedule. She did it on speaker only after getting my nod. A woman named Tessa answered. Marjorie introduced herself, cited the schedule reference, and asked a simple question. Can you confirm whether ceremonial authorization was logged yesterday for Schedule C Item 4? A pause. Keyboard sounds. Then, no ceremonial authorization is attached. Marjorie's voice stayed even. Was the item released physically? Yes. Temporary retrieval at 2:18 p.m. Requested under surviving spouse access. Who was listed as active verification authority at the time of retrieval? Another pause. Lena Mercer. Me. And was Elena Mercer contacted? No. That was the first hard proof in a voice that was not mine. The piece had been removed from secured storage under one authority, while bypassing the separate verification condition required for formal symbolic use. My father had used the part of the structure that still answered to him and ignored the part that did not. Vanessa had then worn the necklace publicly at a foundation dinner while my father verbally framed her as legacy continuity. Not grief. Not confusion. Not family mess. A planned bypass. After the call ended, Marjorie drafted a formal preservation notice on the spot. Not a threat. Not yet. Just a directive that all communications, meeting packets, draft transition materials, access requests, and event-related documentation connected to the prior evening's legacy presentation be preserved pending verification review. That goes to whom? I asked. Foundation Council, Board Chair, your father, and the event office. She glanced at me. And it goes before the breakfast convenes. I nodded. She sent it at 8:47 a.m. That time would matter later, because the board breakfast was set for 9, which meant that before my father could begin presenting Vanessa as a natural successor in my mother's diamonds, everyone entering that room would already have a formal notice in their inbox, stating that the symbolic asset used the night before was under verification dispute. That alone would change the air. But part 3 was not finished yet, because the deeper proof came from somewhere uglier. As Marjorie finalized the notice, her assistant brought in the event packet Elise had quietly forwarded that morning. It included the breakfast agenda, donor seating, revised speaking notes, and a one-page continuity concept prepared for board discussion. Vanessa's name was on the footer, not as attendee, as contributor. I read the page standing up. It described public familiarity with Vanessa Mercer as a bridge figure, and referenced last evening's successful visual continuity moment as evidence that stakeholders were emotionally prepared for a soft, family-facing transition around legacy objects and narrative stewardship. Narrative stewardship. I almost laughed. They had language for everything except shame. The page did not mention me by name at all. It referred only to operational continuity already handled internally, as if the years I spent managing my mother's actual work could be abstracted into a background function while Vanessa took the visible end, inheritance. That document was not careless. It was worse. It was articulate. They had planned not just the humiliation, but the interpretation of it. Vanessa wearing the necklace under the portrait was not a private cruelty that happened to help her later. It had already been folded into a transition concept, written down, circulated, and translated into donor-safe language before the dinner was even over. I set the packet down very carefully. Marjorie looked at me. Now you have intent. Yes. That was the first hard proof of deliberate betrayal. Not emotion. Not instinct. Not memory. A retrieval log. A missing authorization. A formal memo. A contributor footer. A written strategy turning my mother's heirloom into a staged continuity device while reducing my actual role to invisible labor. My phone buzzed. It was my father. Where are you? We're about to begin. I looked at the message, then placed the phone face down on Marjorie's desk. For the first time since the ballroom, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was holding the part they had written down. By 9:05, my father's breakfast had already stopped being his. He had booked one of the hotel's smaller conference rooms, the kind designed to make private ambition look respectable. Walnut table, coffee service, cream folders embossed with the foundation seal, morning light across the windows. Vanessa stood beside him in ivory silk, softer and more innocent than the black gown she had worn the night before. She was not wearing the necklace now. That told me two things. Someone had warned her the diamonds were no longer an advantage, and she was already afraid of the paperwork. When I walked in with Marjorie Bell beside me, conversation thinned in stages. The board chair lowered his packet. Foundation counsel turned in her seat. One donor set down her coffee cup without taking a sip. My father looked annoyed before he looked concerned, which was exactly like him. He still thought this was something he could manage with tone. Lena, he said. This is a board discussion. Marjorie set her folder on the table. Then it's the correct room. That landed cleanly. The board chair, Thomas Weller, cleared his throat. Before we begin, we need to address the verification notice sent this morning regarding last night's ceremonial asset use. My father gave a small smile meant to make the whole thing sound tedious. It was a family misunderstanding. No, I said, taking an empty seat without asking. It was a document decision. That changed the room. Moral arguments can be softened. Procedures cannot. Marjorie distributed 3 copies from her folder. Trust schedule, retrieval log, authorization condition, continuity memo. Nothing dramatic, just the chain. Thomas opened the first page. Charles, did you retrieve the Schedule C necklace yesterday under spouse access? My father stayed standing. I had my wife's necklace brought up for dinner. That's all. It was not just dinner, Marjorie said. It was a donor-facing foundation event. Vanessa spoke then, too quickly. I wore it to honor my mother. I slid the continuity sheet from the breakfast packet and placed it flat on the table. Then why does this memo describe last night as a successful visual continuity moment? No one moved. The phrase sat there in the middle of the room like a body no one wanted to claim. Thomas looked down at the page again. So did Foundation Counsel. One donor, Marianne Pike, read to the bottom and tapped the footer with one finger. Contributor, she said. Vanessa Mercer. Vanessa's face changed before my father's did. That mattered. It meant she already knew what was on the page. This was the real reveal. Not that they had humiliated me in public. Not even that they had planned it. It was that they had already translated the humiliation into institutional language. The necklace, the portrait, the speech, the seating, the photograph line, none of it had been treated as family emotion. It had been turned into transition material. Foundation Counsel looked at Marjorie. What exactly are you asserting? Marjorie did not rush. Unauthorized symbolic use of a trust-monitored asset in a foundation setting, paired with continuity language designed to influence perception before governance review. That was when the money entered the room. Not as cash, as donor trust. Marianne Pike set down her cup. If a legacy object was used to pre-signal succession outside process, then donor interpretation was manipulated. No one contradicted her. My mother had built the foundation on discipline, not sentiment. Shelter funding, medical partnerships, Restricted gifts. Compliance. Donors can tolerate grief. They do not tolerate family theater dressed up as governance once their money is inside the structure. Thomas turned another page. According to this governance memo, Lena Mercer is the temporary operational custodian during unsettled transition. Yes, I said. He looked at the breakfast concept sheet. And according to this packet, her role is described only as operational continuity already handled internally. Yes, that one contrast exposed the whole strategy. They had not planned to replace my work immediately. They had planned to erase it from view. Vanessa would carry image, symbolism, donor optics, public softness. I would continue carrying the actual structure until they could either push me out later or keep me useful without credit. My father finally sat down. That small movement told the truth before he did. This is being exaggerated, he said. Vanessa is naturally stronger in public-facing situations. Lena has always preferred the operational side. We were trying to respect both daughters' strengths. It would have sounded reasonable if the documents were not already on the table. Marianne looked at him steadily. So the plan was for Lena to keep the work while Vanessa wore the legacy. He flushed. That is not what I said. It is what the packet says, I replied. The room went quiet again. I remembered my mother once telling me, during one of her treatment weeks, if anyone starts using the word legacy too often, check what they're moving behind the furniture. At the time, I thought she was being dry. Now I understood she had been precise. Foundation Counsel turned to the retrieval log. The necklace left secured storage at 2:18 p.m., under spouse access. Active verification authority remained Lena Mercer. No ceremonial authorization was requested or attached. She looked up. That is not sentimental use. That is a compliance defect. My father leaned forward. Surely we are not treating a tribute dinner like some kind of offense, Marjorie answered calmly. We are treating it like representational use of a controlled asset in a formal foundation context. Vanessa tried a different path. Softer voice, smaller face. I didn't understand that level of detail. I thought Dad had handled it. Another mistake. Because now she had moved herself from rightful successor to unqualified participant. Thomas looked at her. You contributed to transition materials? Only the communications framing. So you understood there was a transition. Vanessa said nothing. Marianne closed the packet. You used grief to move optics ahead of governance. My father turned toward her, but there was nowhere clean for him to go now. Anger would make him look guilty. Denial would make him look foolish. Silence made him look caught. Foundation Council made the first formal recommendation. All discussion of family-facing continuity, representational stewardship, or symbolic succession should be suspended pending document review. Thomas nodded immediately. Agreed. That was the first structural loss. The breakfast my father had built the entire dinner to support was dead before anyone touched the pastries. Then Elise, who had come in to refresh the coffee and stayed by the sideboard with perfect professional stillness, stepped forward with 2 proof sheets in hand. There are draft newsletter layouts from last night's photographer, she said. One identifies Vanessa as carrying Helen Mercer's public legacy into the next chapter. She handed them to Thomas. He read the caption once and put the page down as if it were contaminated. My father turned toward Elise too sharply. Why are you involved in this? She held his gaze. Because foundation records are involved in this. That was the social shift. Small, but irreversible. People who had spent years functioning as furniture in my father's version of the family were no longer protecting the scene. They were protecting the record. The dinner had not just been meant to influence the board. It had already been prepared for publication. Once the image ran with the right caption, the false version of succession would start hardening. Vanessa in the necklace. Vanessa under the portrait. Vanessa as continuity. By the time I objected, I would look possessive instead of displaced. It was not one humiliation. It was an attempted transfer of narrative. Thomas straightened the proof sheets and spoke with more authority than he had used all morning. All donor-facing materials implying family succession are pulled. Any continuity discussion is suspended. Use of legacy objects in public settings is frozen until council clears it. Operational authority remains where the current documents place it. He did not need to say my name. Everyone in the room already knew it. My father stared at the table. Vanessa stared at the packet. Neither of them had expected the same thing my mother had always trusted. When structure finally enters the room, it does not care whose feelings it embarrasses. The meeting should have ended there. But Foundation Council lifted one final page from Marjorie's folder and said, "Because this retrieval appears to have bypassed required authorization conditions, I also recommend review of recent spouse access movements involving scheduled assets and secure storage permissions." That hit my father harder than the suspension had. The necklace was one object. The safe was a system. And if the system opened, the room would stop asking what happened last night and start asking what else had already been moved in the dark and prepared for daylight. That was when I knew the morning had fully turned. They had tried to use my mother's legacy as a ladder. Instead, they had invited the entire structure to inspect their hands. The safe review began that afternoon. And that was when the whole thing changed shape. Until then, my father could still have tried to frame the dinner as grief handled badly. Vanessa could still have hidden behind tribute, family emotion, or the usual softness people use when they want the room to excuse ambition. But systems are rude in ways families never are. Once Foundation Council requested the access history tied to spouse retrieval and scheduled legacy items, the question was no longer what anyone meant. It was what had been moved, when, and under whose name. By 2 o'clock, I was back at the Foundation offices with Marjorie, Nora Hastings from Council, and Thomas Weller. My father had not been invited to guide the review. That mattered more than it looked. For years, he had controlled family conflict by becoming the first voice people heard. Without him shaping the tone, the facts arrived in their own order. The access report covered 6 months. The necklace was not the only item retrieved under spouse access. There had been 3 removals from secure storage during the period after my mother's final hospitalization and before governance fully settled. The Schedule C necklace, a set of handwritten campaign notebooks from the shelter expansion years, and a sealed envelope attached to the restricted memorabilia file for deferred family review. The notebooks had been returned. The envelope had been signed out, returned, then signed out again a month later, for what the vault manager described as private family sorting. I stared at the page. The envelope mattered because I remembered it. My mother had assembled several packets like that during one of her clearer stretches. Not because she was sentimental, but because she understood something ugly about dying inside a family structure. If you did not organize your own meaning, other people would do it for you. She labeled what was private, what was legal, what was ceremonial, and what was never to be turned into public story. Nora looked up from the report. Was there any authorization trail on the second removal? The vault manager, Tessa, was on speaker again. No additional authorization was attached. Who picked it up? A pause. Keyboard sounds. Vanessa Mercer. No one said anything for a moment. Not because it was surprising anymore. Because it was clarifying. The necklace had been visible theft, meant for a room full of witnesses. This was quieter. Earlier. More deliberate. The kind of thing people do when they are not planning a single scene, but a whole version of the dead they intend to manage. Thomas frowned. Do we know what was inside? Tessa answered carefully. We do not inventory sealed personal packets beyond reference tags. The outside notation reads, personal letters, private instructions, not for promotional use. Not for promotional use. That line settled over the room more heavily than the necklace had. It drew the moral line in ink. Whatever they had told themselves while staging the dinner, they had already gone somewhere smaller and uglier before that. They had handled the parts of my mother's legacy she had explicitly protected from performance. Vanessa had not only worn my mother's diamonds, she had also put her hands on material my mother marked private and non-promotional while helping develop public-facing continuity language around the same legacy. After the call ended, I drove home before Noah got back from school because I needed 1 hour in my mother's study without anyone asking me to summarize how I felt. Her room was still mostly as she had left it, not preserved like a shrine, just not overwritten. Her pencil cup still sat by the window. 2 outdated calendars remained stacked on a side shelf. A half-used pad of yellow legal paper lay in the top drawer beneath a pair of reading glasses and a packet of cough drops. Even when she was sick, she had worked like someone trying to leave less chaos for other people. I sat down in her chair and ran my hand lightly over the desk blotter where old writing had left faint indentations in the leather. Nothing dramatic happened there. No lawyer called. No document arrived. The house was completely quiet. But that silence carried more weight than the breakfast room had. In that small, ordinary space, I could feel the real obscenity of what they had done. My mother had spent the last years of her life trying to make grief easier to survive for the people around her. My father and sister had studied the same materials for advantage. There was a knock at the frame. Noah stood there with his backpack still hanging from one shoulder. "Dad said you were in here." "I am." He looked around the room in the quiet way children do when they miss someone without wanting to turn missing into a performance. Then he looked back at me. "Did they do more than the necklace?" "Yes." He stepped farther inside. "Were they taking Grandma's things?" "Not exactly." He waited. They were trying to take control of what her things meant. That he understood immediately. I saw it happen in his face. He reached out and touched the edge of one of my mother's binders on the shelf. "That's worse." "Yes," I said. "It is." He nodded once and left me there. That small exchange stayed with me longer than the calls and the logs. Children usually understand the center of a betrayal before adults do. Objects can be returned. Meaning, once manipulated in public, takes much more to restore. By early evening, Nora sent over the first preservation batch from the Foundation server. It included donor draft language, internal campaign notes, and tracked comments on the legacy materials. I opened them at the kitchen island while Daniel made pasta neither of us was really hungry for. One note in Vanessa's markup read, "Make Lena less visible here, too operational, wrong emotional tone for forward-facing continuity." Another, attached to a photo set from the archive, said, "Use images where mom is with dad or me. Less paperwork energy." I stared at that line so long the screen dimmed. Less paperwork energy. That was how she had reduced my years with my mother. The treatment schedules, the hospital folders, the shelter ledgers, the donor corrections, the signatures, pickups, calendars, and quiet acts that kept real things from breaking. She looked directly at discipline and translated it into a branding problem. Daniel set a bowl beside me and leaned over just far enough to read. When he straightened again, his face had changed. "She was editing you out while you were still carrying the work," he said. Yes, that was the truth of it. My father had always preferred the public version of loyalty. The daughter on his arm. The soft voice at the podium. The person who made a room feel warm without forcing him to talk about systems. But Vanessa had done something more deliberate. She had looked at the evidence of my labor and decided it should be softened, cropped, pushed off frame and translated into a flaw. She did not simply benefit from my disappearance. She curated it. Nora's batch included one more document. This one from a donor call draft my father had prepared 2 weeks earlier and never used. In it, he described Vanessa as the daughter who has brought warmth back to Helen Mercer's legacy after a period of difficult internal management. Difficult internal management. That was me. Not by name, of course. Families like mine rarely poison openly when they can do it politely. They turn the woman who carried the burden into the woman who made things heavy. Then they present her replacement as relief. I closed the laptop for a moment because I needed the dark screen between me and the words. The deeper obscenity was not only that they wanted the position, it was that they were building it while I still trusted the routine of grief. While I handled bills, records, follow-ups, and the first impossible year after my mother's death, they were already sorting through what could be reframed, repackaged, and sold back to the room as continuity. Later that night, Marjorie called with one more detail. "The envelope was opened," she said. "How do you know?" "There's a seal discrepancy in the vault report. The re-entry notation doesn't match the original closure reference." I leaned against the counter. "Can that be proved?" "Yes, and there's more." She paused only briefly. Nora found a scanned excerpt attached to an internal media prep note. For a second I did not understand. Then I did. They had opened private family material marked not for promotional use. lifted language from it, and started feeding it into campaign preparation. What excerpt? I asked. A line from one of your mother's personal letters, Marjorie said. It says Vanessa brought lightness into difficult rooms when others only knew how to manage them. I shut my eyes, because I knew exactly what kind of line that was. Not a governance instruction, not a leadership endorsement, just one mother trying to love two daughters, honestly in different ways. My mother would have written that to comfort Vanessa, who always needed her tenderness said out loud. And now they had tried to pull that sentence out of private love and convert it into institutional meaning. That was beyond opportunism. It was intimate misuse. My mother had trusted that even if her family disappointed her, private tenderness would at least remain private. My father and sister had decided even that could be mined if the timing was useful. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen long after the sink had finished running. Daniel did not interrupt me. Some forms of pain do not need fixing. They only need enough room to become clear. What changed now was the nature of the consequence. This was no longer just a procedural problem, and it was no longer only proof that Vanessa had helped build the setup. The structure underneath it was morally rotten. They were not honoring my mother. They were mining her. Her jewelry, her language, her private letters, her image, her tenderness, anything that could be lifted, reframed, and handed to a room as continuity. And they had done it while I was still acting as if grief deserved trust. Before bed, I went back into my mother's study and turned off the lamp over her desk. The room dimmed slowly, and in the half-light I could see the chair where she used to sit with a legal pad on her lap, correcting numbers while tea went cold beside her. What they had tried to take was never just a necklace. It was her meaning. And the worst part was that they had started taking it long before the dinner, while I was still close enough to mistake their planning for family. By the next morning, my father had stopped pretending the breakfast had been a misunderstanding. He moved to the next strategy instead. If the documents would not support him, he would try to make me look unfit to hold them. At 8:26, Foundation Counsel forwarded me a letter from my father's private attorney. The subject line was polite enough to sound responsible. Interim stability recommendation. The language underneath was cleaner than anything he had said out loud, which made it more dangerous. Pending review. I was to be distanced from legacy-sensitive communications and ceremonial decisions because my grief response had allegedly begun affecting institutional calm. The letter referred to my heightened emotional attachment to certain family objects and warned that my continued involvement risked turning a continuity process into a sibling conflict with reputational consequences. I read it once, then again. He was not defending the necklace anymore. He was trying to redefine me. That was the real escalation. Once the records started turning against them, they stopped arguing about what happened and started arguing about who I was. If they could not justify bypassing the structure, they would try to disqualify the person holding it. Reduce years of operational authority to grief. Reduce oversight to sentiment. Reduce me to a daughter too emotional to be trusted around legacy. Daniel read the letter at the kitchen counter and looked up at me. He's trying to turn evidence into instability. Yes, I said. And if that sticks, then you're no longer the person protecting the structure. You're just the grieving woman attached to jewelry. That was exactly it. At 10 o'clock, Nora sent another note. Overnight, my father had privately contacted 2 board members. He urged them to protect the foundation from emotional spillover and described Vanessa as a gentler public steward for the next chapter. He also suggested I had become too embedded in the worst parts of my mother's decline to represent the future well. So now there were 2 attacks running at once. One procedural, one social. He wanted me framed as too emotional for governance and too associated with sickness, records, treatment, and decline to carry legacy attractively. The cruelty of it was almost elegant. The years I spent doing the hardest work for my mother were being recast as proof that I should now be moved aside. By noon, the language had started spreading the way. Damaging language always does in respectable circles. 2 women from the Auxiliary Donor Committee reached out separately, each with the same careful tone, each saying they hoped the family side could be handled gently and privately. That phrase did not come from nowhere. It had already begun moving through calls and whispers and sympathetic edits until it sounded like common sense. Family side. Gentle handling. Stability. Those were not accusations I could confront directly. That was what made them useful. They were trying to move me out of the room without beating the documents. I went alone to pick up Noah from school because I needed 20 minutes inside ordinary life before the next call arrived. He got into the back seat, shut the door, and waited until we were moving before he asked, "Did Grandpa get in trouble?" "Not yet," I said. He looked out the window for a moment. He smiled at me last night like nothing happened. That landed deeper than the lawyer's letter had. Children notice moral discontinuity faster than adults. My father had humiliated me publicly, tried to move my mother's legacy around me, and still expected to remain harmless and grandfather-shaped to my son. That was another form of entitlement. Not just to assets or image. To innocence. "What did you do?" I asked. "Nothing." He paused, then added, "I didn't want him to think it was okay." That small answer stayed with me all afternoon. No speech. No dramatic loyalty. Just a child refusing to help an older man normalize what he had done. When we got home, there was a messenger envelope waiting at the door. Inside was a draft proposal for informal family resolution. The language was smooth enough to sound generous. Vanessa would step back from immediate legacy symbolism. In return, I would refrain from challenging future family representation decisions and agree not to raise additional objections tied to prior ceremonial misunderstandings. It took less than a minute to see what it really was. They would surrender the necklace incident if I surrendered the future. No review of the safe. No consequences for the private letters. No scrutiny of donor messaging. No formal acknowledgement that my mother's structure had been bypassed on purpose. Just a clean little deal. Let the visible insult go away, and stay silent while the deeper machinery remains intact. Daniel unpacked groceries while I read it at the counter. "They're retreating," he said. "No," I said. "They're buying silence." That was the psychological pressure point. Once they realized they could not win quickly through the foundation, they tried to force me into the position women are pushed into all the time. Accept the partial concession and be praised as graceful, or keep going and be called punishing. I did not respond. Instead, Marjorie arranged a formal review session for the next morning with Nora and Thomas present. No spectacle. Just a record-building meeting to examine the continuity packet, the access history, the private letter excerpt, the donor whispers, and the attorney letter together. Once those pieces sat in the same room, the pattern would become harder to soften. At 6:40 p.m. my father called. I answered because sometimes a voice reveals more than a filing ever will. "Lena," he said, already tired in the way men sound when they want their pressure to feel like reason. "You're taking this too far." I stepped into the pantry and closed the door so Noah would not hear. "Am I? This can still be handled privately. You made it public before I said a word." A pause. "That dinner was meant to honor your mother." "No," I said. "It was meant to introduce Vanessa." He exhaled sharply. "You always do this. You take structure and use it like a weapon when people are trying to move forward." There it was. He was not denying the structure. He was resenting that I would not let it remain decorative. I said nothing, so he kept going. "Your mother needed softness near the end," he said. "Not management. Vanessa gave her that." The cruelty of that line was so clean it almost emptied the room of air. Because it was not really about Vanessa. It was about punishing the form my love had taken. I was the daughter who drove, documented, signed, tracked, corrected, followed up, read billing statements, learned medication schedules, and kept real life from breaking while everyone else preferred tone. He wanted to translate all of that into emotional failure. "You needed someone to do the work," I said. "I needed a daughter who understood legacy as human." "No," I said. "You needed one who photographed better." He went silent. That silence told me more than anything else could have. When he spoke again, the patience was gone. "If you force this review, do not expect the family to forgive what follows." Family. He used the word the way people use property they think already belongs to them. I think," I said, "you're confusing forgiveness with access." Then I hung up. That call did something useful. It ended the last illusion that this might still collapse back into ordinary family damage. He was no longer pretending this had been a mistake. He was threatening separation if I refused displacement. That is the moment pressure becomes clarity. Later that evening, Thomas forwarded Marjorie a short note from one of the board members my father had contacted privately. She wrote that he had urged her to keep me from turning this into a control issue and described me as dangerously identified with my mother's institutional machinery. He had also called Vanessa emotionally cleaner for the next chapter. Emotionally cleaner. That phrase joined the others perfectly. Difficult internal management. Less paperwork energy. Gentler steward. Each one did the same thing from a different angle. They were not simply trying to replace me. They were building a moral vocabulary to make replacement look merciful. I printed the note and added it to the review folder. Then I went upstairs to check on Noah. He was at his desk, pretending to sort school papers while listening to The Shape of the House. "Did Grandpa call?" he asked. "Yes." He kept his eyes on the desk. "Are we still going to his house on Sundays?" That question hurt more than the attorney's letter. Not "Are you okay?" Not "What did he say?" "Are we still going?" That was the emotional cost finally arriving in plain form. Betrayal had moved out of documents and into routine. Into a child trying to understand whether family habits still deserved to survive. I sat on the edge of his bed. "I don't know yet." He nodded slowly. "I don't want to act normal if nothing is normal." Neither did I. "No one is going to make you pretend," I said. He accepted that with the seriousness children reserve for promises they plan to remember. After he went to shower, I stood in the hallway listening to the water start. Daniel came up beside me and rested a hand lightly at the back of my neck. "They're getting uglier," he said. "Yes. Are you ready for tomorrow?" I thought of the attorney letter. The donor whispers. The call. The proposal for silence. The board outreach. The language they kept using to turn my labor into a flaw and Vanessa's softness into legitimacy. I thought of my father trying to make procedure look cruel because it refused to flatter him. "Yes," I said. And I was. Because by then they had done something better for me than make a mistake. They had escalated in writing, by phone, through counsel, through donors, through family routine itself. They had shown exactly how far they were willing to go once the document stopped serving them. The next room would not be about whether they had crossed a line. It would be about who still wanted to stand beside them after the line was named. The formal review began at 10 the next morning, and by then my father had lost the one advantage he trusted most: control of the story. Thomas Weller sat at the head of the table with Nora Hastings beside him and Marjorie across from her. Marianne Pike was there in person. Ellen Brooks joined by video. Elise sat near the wall with the record file and a legal pad, not as staff caught in family weather, but as part of the room. My father arrived with Vanessa 3 minutes late, carrying the expression of a man who still believed dignity could substitute for proof. No one helped him. Thomas opened plainly. "This review concerns unauthorized symbolic use of a trust-monitored legacy asset, related continuity materials, and subsequent attempts to influence governance review." My father leaned back. "This has become absurd." Nora did not even glance at him. "Then the documents should help you." That stripped the atmosphere out of the room immediately. My father had always relied on tone, on his ability to make other people feel that pushing him further would be rude. But procedure has no manners. Once the record is on the table, politeness stops protecting anyone. Marjorie summarized the sequence cleanly. The necklace had been retrieved under spouse access without required ceremonial authorization. The active verification authority had not been contacted. The necklace had then been used at a donor-facing event where Vanessa was visually positioned as continuity beneath Helen Mercer's portrait. A continuity memo described the scene as a successful visual moment and identified Vanessa as contributor. Internal comments reduced my role while elevating hers. Afterward, board outreach, donor whispers, and an attorney letter attempted to recast my objection as instability. A private envelope marked not for promotional use had been opened, and a line from one of my mother's personal letters had migrated into media preparation. When Marjorie finished, the room was completely still. Not confused. Not divided. Still. My father chose offense first. I'm not going to sit here while a family tribute is turned into misconduct because my eldest daughter resents her sister. The sentence landed and died. No one rushed in to soften it. No one translated it into something more respectable. That was the first unmistakable sign he had lost the room. The old method was failing in real time. Marianne Pike was the first to answer. This is not about resentment. It is about your attempt to make us absorb a transfer before one existed. My father turned to her, but she held his gaze without effort. Donors can tolerate family imperfection. What they do not tolerate is being pre-managed into accepting a false version of governance. Vanessa stepped in next. She had dressed carefully that morning. Pale blue, quiet jewelry, softness without glamour. Even her voice had been chosen. I loved my mother, she said. I wore the necklace because of that. I helped with communications because someone had to keep the foundation from feeling cold. There it was again. Their whole vocabulary in one sentence. I was structure. She was warmth. I was management. She was humanity. I was necessary until the room was ready for someone prettier to inherit the visible part. But now the table had paper. Nora turned one page and read aloud. Make Lena less visible here too. Operational wrong emotional tone for forward-facing continuity. Vanessa went still. That was a draft note, she said. Yes, Nora replied. A draft note reducing the operational custodian while preparing public-facing continuity around yourself. It was about tone. No, I said. It was about removal. That was the first time I had cut across her directly since the ballroom. Because I had waited, the sentence struck harder than anything longer would have. Vanessa looked at me with practiced hurt. Lena, that isn't fair. Marjorie lifted the next document without changing expression. Fairness is not the issue. Intent is. Then she read from my father's unused donor remarks. The daughter who has brought warmth back to Helen Mercer's legacy after a period of difficult internal management. No one needed help identifying who difficult internal management meant. Ellen Brooks spoke from the screen at the far end of the room. Charles used similar language with me. He said Elena was too identified with the institution's machinery and Vanessa was emotionally cleaner for the next chapter. That was the moment the private script became public evidence. You could feel the change moving around the table. Not shock exactly. Recognition. These were not isolated phrases. They were a coordinated vocabulary. My father and sister had been using the same language across donors, board members, draft materials, and family negotiations to make displacement sound compassionate. My father tried to recover ground. I was speaking broadly about presentation. Thomas looked down at the file in front of him. Broadly enough to contact board members during an active review and suggest the current custodian was the problem? No one rescued him from the question. Nora lifted the attorney letter next. Your counsel described Elena's role as emotionally destabilizing to institutional calm. He opened his mouth, but there was nowhere left for him to go. Denial would make him look foolish. Anger would make him look guilty. Silence made him look caught. Thomas nodded toward Elise. The newsletter proof. She stepped forward and placed the printout in front of him. The caption sat beneath the ballroom photograph in clean black type. Vanessa Mercer carries Helen Mercer's public legacy into the next chapter. Thomas read it once and set it down. So this was already moving outward, he said. No one answered, because no answer helped them now. If they admitted it, they confirmed narrative conversion. If they denied it, they implicated staff. If they blamed a consultant, the markup trail still led back to them. Marianne broke the silence. This was not a family tribute. It was external positioning. That was the phrase the morning had been building toward. Not grief. Not conflict. Not misunderstanding. Positioning. My father finally looked at me then. And for the first time since the dinner, he seemed less angry than disbelieving, as if he still could not accept that I had let the structure run all the way to consequence instead of stepping in privately to preserve him. Lena, he said, softer now. Is this really necessary? I looked back at him and felt almost nothing personal left. You made it necessary, I said. That ended the room. Not dramatically. Not with noise. just with precision. Thomas straightened the pages in front of him and spoke with the calm of someone who had stopped considering multiple versions of events. I am prepared to make interim findings. No one interrupted. First, the retrieval and representational use of the Schedule C necklace occurred outside required authorization conditions. Second, continuity language and visual positioning were developed around that use before governance review. Third, subsequent communications attempted to reframe legitimate structural objection as emotional instability. Fourth, restricted personal material appears to have been opened and mined for positioning purposes, despite explicit designation against promotional use. At the fourth point, Vanessa inhaled sharply. My father did not look at her. Thomas continued. Effective immediately, all family-facing representation of the Mercer legacy is suspended. All spouse access retrieval rights for scheduled symbolic assets are frozen. All external communications implying succession are withdrawn. Lena Mercer remains sole recognized operational custodian pending full review. That was the structural collapse. Not a lost argument. Not a bad morning. Access frozen. Communications pulled. Succession suspended. Authority confirmed elsewhere. Nora added the next measure with terrible calm. Council will also recommend a forensic review of recent secure storage movements and campaign preparation materials to determine whether additional breaches exist. That hit my father harder than the findings themselves. The necklace was one incident. A forensic review was an opening. It meant the room was no longer asking what happened at dinner. It was asking what else had been touched before the dinner, after it, and in preparation for what came next. This is punitive, my father said too quickly. No, Marianne replied. This is what happens when people stop trusting your handling. And that was the social collapse. Not outrage. Something far more final. Withdrawal. Thomas no longer addressed my father as a family guide. Nora spoke to him like a compliance subject. Marianne looked at Vanessa as part of a credibility problem, not a grieving daughter. Ellen had stopped sounding cautious and started sounding certain. Even Elise, standing quietly with her notepad, no longer carried the posture of someone trapped between loyalty and employment. She looked like someone whose institution had finally chosen truth over manners. Vanessa made one last attempt to save herself. She turned toward me instead of the board. I never tried to erase you. It might have worked before the file. It might even have worked before the breakfast. But Thomas answered before I did. Your edits asked for Lena to be made less visible. Nora lifted the media prep note. And you drew from material your mother marked not for promotional use. Vanessa's eyes filled then, but too late. The room had passed the point where tears could soften intent. My father understood it a second after she did. You could see it in the way he stopped performing composure. For years he had counted on two things. That women like me would choose privacy over consequence, and that institutions would prefer a polite lie to a documented mess. He had misjudged both. Thomas closed the main file. Interim findings will circulate this afternoon. That was the public break. No one argued after that. No one tried to comfort my father. No one offered Vanessa a softer reading of what she had done. As the chairs shifted and papers were gathered, Ellen's voice came once more through the speaker. Helen built this foundation on rigor. I think we forgot, for a while. That rigor was one of the forms her love took. The room stayed quiet, but everyone heard her. That mattered more than sympathy. For the first time, the work I had done beside my mother, the records, the schedules, the corrections, the safeguards, the stubborn precision was no longer being treated as coldness that needed softening. It was being recognized for what it had always been. Devotion with structure. My father stood up slowly. But he no longer looked like the man from the ballroom. He looked smaller than his suit. Smaller than his voice. Smaller than the story he had tried to force the room to carry. Vanessa rose beside him without touching anything. No one stopped them when they left. No one followed. That was the collapse. Not a scream. Not a confession. Not a revenge speech. Just a room full of witnesses deciding, one by one, that they would not carry their version of the story anymore. The interim findings went out at 3:17 that afternoon. I know the exact time because I was in my mother's study when the email arrived. standing by the window with one hand on the back of her chair. Outside, the magnolia tree at the edge of the yard was finally starting to bloom, late and uneven, the way it often did after a cold spring. Inside, the room was quiet except for the soft sound of my laptop notification and the radiator ticking under the sill. I opened the message and read it once. Then I closed it. Not because it was unimportant. Because by then, the structure was doing what it was supposed to do. And I no longer needed to stand over every line to make sure the truth survived. That was the shift. For weeks, maybe longer without knowing it, I had been forced into the exhausting position of carrying meaning by hand my mother's work. My place in it. The facts of what was being moved around me. Now the record held it. The board held it. Council held it. The institution my mother had built was no longer asking me to translate her legacy back into something recognizable. It had recognized it itself. The findings were clean and final in tone. Family-facing legacy representation suspended. Spouse access retrieval rights frozen. All external campaign materials implying succession withdrawn. Operational custodianship confirmed under current governance structure pending full review. Forensic audit to proceed. No dramatic language. No moral adjectives. No theatrical condemnation. That was why it was so final. Punishment invites argument. Procedure leaves less room. Downstairs, I heard Noah come in from the backyard and drop his shoes by the door without being asked. A minute later, he appeared in the study holding a science worksheet and a pencil. He glanced at my face, then at the closed laptop. Was it bad? He asked. No, I said. It was clear. He thought about that, then nodded, as if clarity belonged in a different category from bad news. Can I do my homework in here? Of course. He sat on the small side chair near the bookshelf and bent over his worksheet while I turned on the desk lamp. For the next 20 minutes, nothing important happened in the dramatic sense. He erased answers. I answered one email from Nora with a simple thank you. A branch tapped lightly against the outside glass. At one point, Noah asked how to spell ecosystem, though I knew he already knew, and only wanted the comfort of hearing another voice in the room. That quiet mattered more than any speech could have. This was the future my father and Vanessa had not understood when they staged the dinner. Legacy does not live only in necklaces, podiums, or donor captions. It lives in who can still sit in the room afterward without pretending. In whether a child feels safe asking ordinary questions again. In whether silence has become peaceful instead of tense. Near 5 o'clock, Daniel came to the door and leaned against the frame. There's a courier envelope for you. I went downstairs and found it on the kitchen counter. It was from my father's attorney. Inside was a short notice acknowledging receipt of the interim findings, confirming Vanessa's withdrawal from all pending representational activity, and requesting coordination for the immediate return of the necklace and any related symbolic items still under dispute. There was no argument in it. No mention of tribute, grief, fairness, or family misunderstanding. The language had become careful, narrow, and obedient to process. That alone told me more than an apology could have. My father had run out of narrative. Now he only had compliance. An hour later, another message came. This one from Elise. The draft newsletter had been deleted from circulation. The photo set from the dinner was archived under legal hold. The campaign team had been instructed to remove all family image succession framing pending a full governance review. She ended the email with one simple line. Helen would have liked the paperwork on this. I smiled for the first time that day. Not because I had won something, because the sentence was true. That evening, we ate dinner at the kitchen table with the windows cracked open to let in the cooler air. Pasta, salad, bread. Noah burned slightly in the toaster oven, and then insisted was fine. No one talked about the review for the first 10 minutes. Then Noah asked very seriously, So, Aunt Vanessa isn't Grandma now? Daniel looked down at his plate to hide a smile. I set my fork down. No, I said. No one was ever going to be. He accepted that immediately. Okay. Then he took another bite and asked if he could skip Sunday dinner at Grandpa's house for a while. Not forever. Not dramatically. Just for a while. Yes, I said. Daniel glanced at me but did not speak. He understood what that answer meant. Not punishment, Not a family declaration, just a boundary, entering the house quietly, and being allowed to stay. After dinner, while Daniel loaded the dishwasher and Noah showered, I went to the hall closet and took down the small lockbox where I kept personal papers that still mattered. Not trust documents. Not foundation records. Mine. I opened it at the kitchen island and placed inside a copy of the interim findings, the access freeze notice, and the letter confirming the return request for the necklace. Then I added something else. A photograph of my mother and me in the shelter office on opening week. Both of us tired, sleeves rolled up, laughing over a printer jam. No diamonds, no portrait lighting, no donor audience. Just real work and the strange joy of surviving it with someone who understood why the details mattered. That was the image I wanted near the record. Not because it proved anything to anyone else. Because it reminded me what had actually been defended. Later, after Noah was asleep, I went back into my mother's study one last time. The lamp on her desk cast a low gold circle over the leather blotter, and the neat stack of unopened mail I still had not sorted. I sat in her chair and looked around the room without trying to turn the moment into meaning bigger than it was. The truth was smaller and stronger. My father had wanted a daughter who looked like continuity. Vanessa had wanted a version of legacy that could be worn. What neither of them understood was that my mother had already answered that question before she died. Not in a speech, not in a sentimental scene, in structure, in condition, in records. In the quiet, stubborn decision to place protection where performance could not charm it away. The house was still. The audit would continue. More documents would be reviewed. More consequences might come. But I did not need them that night. The essential thing had already happened. The room had seen clearly. The institution had corrected itself. My son had stopped asking whether we had to act normal. And I was no longer arguing with anyone. When the necklace came back, it would return to the safe under the same name it had always answered to in the only place that mattered. The record. I turned off the desk lamp, closed the study door softly behind me, and went upstairs. No one called after that.